Trayvon Martin, a black teenage boy in Florida, was followed and killed by someone who thought he was in the wrong neighborhood. In 2014, Michael Brown, a young black teenager who had recently graduated from high school, was killed by a police officer in Ferguson, Missouri, and his body was left laying in the street for hours. Later that same year, Eric Garner, a black man in New York City, was choked to death by a police officer and was filmed repeating the phrase, "I can't breathe," over and over. These incidents and others sparked massive protests and demonstrations that eventually came to be called the Movement for Black Lives, or the Black Lives Matter movement. In its earliest stages, this movement often focused its energies on criminal justice reform, in particular combating the violent policing of black communities and black people in the United States, and in ending the practice of mass incarceration in the country. And then in 2020, in the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, Breonna Taylor was shot to death by police who raided her apartment while she was asleep. Those officers did not officially face any criminal charges for killing her, and this fact sparked protest and outrage across the nation. And then a few weeks later, George Floyd, a 47-year-old black man, was killed by a police officer in Minneapolis, Minnesota, while calling for his mother and also exclaiming over and over the phrase, "I can't breathe." In response to Floyd's killing, the largest ever collection of protests for racial justice around the world were sparked. And the Movement for Black Lives, a loosely connected network of activists for justice for black Americans in cities around the U.S., began shifting from a criminal justice reform framework to one that's heavily influenced by or explicitly evolved into the movement to abolish prisons, policing, and state surveillance. The fact that the river of unarmed and innocent black people being killed by police was not slowing, despite the sustained efforts of activists across almost a decade, inspired people's activism to move toward more bold, more radical goals. In part, this shift in direction for the movement was informed by a critique of restorative justice. Restorative justice had been practiced in places connected to formal legal systems since the 1970s in some places. And still, mass incarceration occurred, and violent racist policing seems to be on the rise. In addition, scratching beneath the surface of restorative justice's successes, like reduced recidivism rates, shows that the implicit and explicit biases of those who refer cases, police and prosecutors, etc., produces a preference to give white people the opportunity to experience restoration over people who are not white, especially black people. Even more robustly, however, is the abolitionist criticism that the willingness of restorative justice practitioners to partner with criminal legal systems has actually entrenched the powers of racist retribution that so many practitioners thought of themselves as resisting. Restorative justice programs were allowed to exist at the very margins of criminal justice practice, it's argued, to provide cover for the ongoing expansion of the prison industrial complex more broadly. In addition, when formalized inside of criminal legal systems, restorative practices often lose much of their power by becoming less consensual, less contextual, and less relational. Many prison abolitionists spent time as restorative justice practitioners, but then found that its radical and even revolutionary spirit of justice as healing often became constrained and co-opted by dominant systems. Alongside prison abolition, the movement for transformative justice has gained public visibility as an option for resisting our carceral society. Emerging from communities who have been especially positioned to recognize the dangers and pitfalls of state partnership to pursue justice, such as women of color and especially black women, queer communities, disability justice activists, women survivors of sexual violence, incarcerated trans people, and others, transformative justice seeks to build mechanisms for safety, accountability, repair, and healing apart from dominant legal and governmental systems. At the same time that these activists are building community safety and accountability, they are often working to revolutionize current systems and structures into ones that give more life and more justice. Usually paired with anti-capitalist and anti-carceral political commitments, transformative justice activists seek radical political and economic change, even as they focus on hyper-local and contextual ways to build safety and accountability for vulnerable and oppressed communities. Transformative justice is grassroots, in the streets, and often outside of the mainstream gaze of our society. Importantly, many restorative justice practices, like victim-offender mediation and circle processes, are utilized to achieve the work that transformative justice activists do. But they use these practices outside of formal systems and exclusively in community settings. At the same time that this evolution has happened in the Black Lives Matter era, restorative justice has gained wider acceptance outside of criminal legal settings. Schools especially are increasingly adopting restorative practices like circles in their work. Healing and talking circles of various kinds are popping up in church basements and community centers and mental health settings as ways to heal from harm and trauma while simultaneously building community and resiliency. As another example, in the years just before the pandemic, I was connected to a public health initiative to prevent and respond to violence in community-centered ways, using peacemaking and healing circles as tools for community leadership development, violence prevention, personal and communal healing, and as a community-led restorative response to the violence that would still occur after that kind of community-based prevention and healing work. In other words, restorative justice has been gaining ground beyond the kinds of examples that have dominated my previous lectures. And there's now even more discussion in the restorative justice community than there's ever been about restorative justice's role in the work of racial justice. Edward Valandra, a scholar who is Sikangu Titunwan and was born and raised on the Rosebud Sioux Reservation, recently edited a very influential volume in the restorative justice world titled Colorizing Restorative Justice, in which restorative justice practitioners of color tackle the ways that mainstream restorative justice and its white practitioners have ignored questions of racial justice or structural oppression or decolonization, or have actively reinscribed aspects of white supremacy into the movement. And it's true that restorative justice's time is often spent on individual cases and their complexities, and the technical aspects of facilitating any given restorative practice, in ways that sometimes leave far less attention to the kinds of structural questions racial justice movements address. In addition to Valandra's book, Fania Davis, the founder of Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth, published her influential book, The Little Book of Race and Restorative Justice, in which she draws on the idea of Ubuntu to advocate restorative justice as a racial justice tool. And Danielle Sored, director of New York-based restorative justice organization Common Justice, published her groundbreaking book, Until We Reckon, which advocates restorative justice as a way forward for addressing mass incarceration and mass violence in the U.S. And others have published on the theme of using restorative practices to achieve what has come to be called in some spaces racial healing. So in short, we've entered an era of wider experimentation and of critique of restorative justice as this practice has spread since its early years, and the political contexts in which it finds itself have evolved. The question of the role of restorative justice or restorative practices in the work of racial justice and radical politics is now live in the United States, and is perhaps the most important challenge the framework and movement has encountered up to this point in its history. What are we to make of the idea of justice as healing in a world in which the legacies of the colonization of indigenous peoples, the enslavement of Africans, and other forms of racial injustice continue to persist? In a world of various forms of domination, including neoliberal capitalist domination and the related threat of global climate change, what is the point of hyper-localized efforts to heal a relationship or repair a particular harm or facilitate a dialogue? In the rest of our time together, I want to answer these questions by drawing on the critics of restorative justice themselves. In short, I believe a vision of justice as healing, as I've described it in the restorative justice movement, is both what is driving so much radical action for social and racial justice today, and is what we need to achieve the kinds of justice, freedom, and liberation these movements seek. It's not an either-or between practices of justice as healing and radical political change, but a both and. What prison abolitionists and transformative justice practitioners teach us is that a world in which justice as healing is the norm, the default, rather than an alternative, is a different kind of world. We need a world in which carceral, hyper-capitalist, and individualist logics are replaced with a kind of moral imagination in which we recognize that our humanity is bound up in the humanity of everyone else. Put another way, for restorative justice simply to be known as justice requires a world in which everyone knows and acts as if they cannot be human until others are treated as human. Until we recognize in our actions and our societies that we can only be human together. Justice as healing in this formulation is an anti-apartheid framework. Mass incarceration, racist violence and racialized oppression, anti-queer politics, capitalist exploitation, from this perspective are forms of apartheid inasmuch as they drive people apart and lead to dehumanization. Restorative justice is a global movement of rehumanization and repair, and when understood this way, necessitates new politics, new economics, and new structures. One framework that encompasses what I am discussing is that of healing resistance, as introduced by community organizer Kazu Haga. Haga is a restorative justice practitioner inside of California prisons. He's also an advocate and trainer for nonviolent social change in the tradition of Martin Luther King Jr., a tradition often taught by Dr. Bernard Lafayette that's often called Kingian nonviolence conflict reconciliation. Haga is also a climate justice and environmental sustainability activist, and he describes himself as an anti-capitalist. Like Tutu, Yazzie, and others we've learned about, Haga insists that interdependence is at the heart of any vision of radical social change. When interdependence is at the heart of our vision, though, he argues that we must have a dual focus on healing for both ourselves and others, and resistance to the social forces that work against interdependence. Healing and resistance go hand in hand. Even more than that, healing is a form of resistance, and resistance that does not heal does not liberate. Similarly, Fania Davis, a black woman, a member of black liberation movements in the 1970s and 80s, and a leading figure in the modern restorative justice movement, has argued that, quote, healing interpersonal harm requires a commitment to transforming the context in which the injury occurs. The socio-historical conditions and institutions that are structured precisely to perpetuate harm. This commitment may mean viewing restorative justice as not only healing individual harm, but also as transforming social structures and institutions that are themselves purveyors of massive harm. The success of restorative justice depends on seeing ourselves not only as agents of individual transformation, but also as drivers of systems transformation, end quote. And this vision of the connection between healing interpersonal and structural harm emerges from her own understanding of justice, which she says is informed by Ubuntu, by the teachings of Harold and Phil Gettensby, and African indigenous practices of jurisprudence and conflict resolution. What such a vision can do is ground the politics of resistance in a politics of healing by emphasizing the ways that present structures dehumanize through separation, and imagining a different politics that humanizes by building interdependence. What we need, then, is to practice interdependence. If this is true, restorative justice practices like circles, family group conferences, victim offender dialogues, and truth and reconciliation commissions can be understood as exercises in training for the new world of interdependence, even as the seeds for such a new world are still being planted. There does not have to be a division between restorative justice and racial justice. In fact, the two go hand in hand. Indeed, the way that I've told the story of the history of restorative justice as a global movement presumes that racial justice and restorative justice are not opposed, but wholly mutual. And it's my experience in the work of restorative justice that informs this particular way to tell the story, which is not necessarily how everyone would tell it. However, I've never known restorative justice as anything other than the story of radical social transformation that's often led by the most oppressed peoples by dominant social systems, including those experiencing racialized oppression. Restorative justice is the practice of Burma Bushi, Harold Gettensby, Desmond Tutu, Kazu Haga, and the Mexican and black mothers and elders in Los Angeles I met over 20 years ago who were facilitating restorative dialogues in their homes over kitchen tables before I'd ever heard the phrase restorative justice. It's also the movement of Mennonite Christians, a historically persecuted religious minority who've become racialized as white, but who seek their own vision of a radically transformed politics, a politics that reflects the values and commitments of Jesus of Nazareth, whom they call the Christ. Restorative justice, I've argued, is a global movement, led primarily by indigenous and black communities on Turtle Island and abroad that builds encounters of humanization and repair. In the shorthand that I've been using, restorative justice is the work of healing and accountability. What I've tried to argue in this lecture is that while there are aspects of the restorative justice movement as it has evolved since the 1970s that can be critiqued for its less than radical practice, restorative justice at its heart is fundamentally a radical revolution of how we think about and do justice. What the movement for restorative justice can learn from other movements, like the movements for Black Lives, prison abolition, and transformative justice, is that restorative justice will never reach its fullest, most radical potential and vision without the transformation, dare I say the revolution, of many of our social and political structures. So I will end this series of lectures by telling a fictional story written by Mariam Kaba, a leading thinker in both the prison industrial complex abolition and transformative justice movements, who got her start in this work via the practice of restorative justice. In many ways, her work is a practical example of the possibilities of a vision and practice of justice as healing, of humanization and repair that I've outlined in this lecture. Her short story, titled simply Justice, a Short Story, goes like this. Adila is a 16-year-old girl, and Adila lives on a planet called Small Place, which is so green that you can smell it. In Small Place, there are no prisons, even though there are conflicts among its residents that sometimes lead to harm. Rather, there are peace holders, of whom Adila's parents are chief. In Small Place, everyone thinks of each other as relatives, even if they're not part of the same family tree. All things are held in common, and one of their most sacred values is that when one person in the community experiences harm, everyone in the community is harmed. The climate flourishes, everyone is housed, and the sick are cared for. In Small Place, every member of the community is a circle keeper, and much of social life happens in circles. Adila says, quote, "We discuss all of our issues in circle. we celebrate in circle, we mourn in circle. Basically, circles are how we communicate and how we connect, end quote. So one day, a woman from Earth, who is in the story called EV, short for Earth Visitor, visits Small Place and is flabbergasted that there are no prisons and no place to, quote, put the bad people. So Evie carries a knife for protection and decides she is going to test the people of Small Place and prove the need for prisons. And so she murders Adela. After committing the murder, Evie turns herself in to Adela's parents, the chief peaceholders, and asks, "Where will you put me?" "In circle," they reply. The community responds by holding Adela's family in circles for weeks, attending to their pain and grief. In circles, stories about Adela's life are shared, Adela's parents are consoled, and the community rallies around to support them in their grief. And Evie is invited to join each of these circles. By participating in these circles, Evie understands the impact her actions have had on the community and experiences remorse for her action. And Adela, narrating the story, says, quote, "And so it was that my community held Evie in her humanity while seeking to hold her accountable for her actions," end quote. And after all of this, Evie is adopted by Adela's parents and reintegrated into the community to pay her debt to the community as long as Adela's family deems it's necessary. In Small Place, paying her debt means being integrated into the community's life and being held in her humanity. Adela concludes her story by asking, quote, "When we hold each other in our humanity, what other outcome could there be? After all," she says, "vengeance is not justice." Adela, in the story, calls it holding each other in our humanity. Robert Yazzie and Harold Gettensby call it being a good relation. Desmond Tutu called it practicing Ubuntu. Mennonites call it being in right relationship. Kaba, Davis, and Haga have called it healing. I've called it practicing encounters of humanization and repair. In each case, we've seen the possibilities and the challenges of what has come to be called restorative justice. But whatever you call this movement, I invite you to recognize what's often called restorative justice, not as an academic argument or merely as a set of practices, but as a global movement of thinkers, leaders, and everyday people who seek to pursue a different way, a way of healing, a better way for us to be human together.